The morning sun pierced through the dense canopy. Its light refracted into eerie golden shards on the forest floor. The wilderness was awake, but silent, a silence too profound for a place brimming with life. Thuli adjusted the straps of her rifle, the familiar weight offering little comfort. She scanned the trail ahead, her sharp eyes catching every movement, every rustle of the underbrush. To her, this silence wasn't peace, it was warning. Something was off. "They'll say I botched this, whatever happens," she muttered under her breath, her words swallowed by the vastness of the bush. Her radio crackled, breaking the tension. "Thuli, any sign yet?" It was Ranger Moyo, his tone laced with condescension. "Negative," she replied curtly, suppressing the urge to throw the radio into the thicket. Every interaction reminded her of her place here, not a ranger, but a woman playing at one, or so they believed. She trudged on, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Memories of Sibo's mocking laughter played in her mind. "You think you can handle this? A little girl in a man's world?" The underbrush thickened, the trees standing like sentinels, their gnarled roots reaching out like claws. Thuli paused. The air was heavier here, carrying an unexplainable tang of decay. Ahead, a glint of metal caught her eye. She approached cautiously, her heart quickening. It was a ranger's badge, smeared with dried blood, tangled in a web of vines. Her breath hitched. The silence deepened, and with it came a sound, low, guttural, unnatural. It wasn't an animal she recognized. It wasn't human. Something was watching. Thuli crouched near the blood-smeared badge, her fingers brushing the dried crimson crusting its edges. The metallic tang of old blood mingled with the thick, damp air, filling her nostrils. She clenched her jaw. This wasn't just an accident. It couldn't be. The ground nearby was disturbed, clawed up as if something heavy had been dragged through the underbrush. Broken branches and crushed ferns marked a crude path deeper into the trees. A low growl echoed, faint and guttural, sending a shiver rippling up her spine. Thuli froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, her senses sharp. The wilderness seemed to hold its breath with her, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. Then she heard it, her name. Thuli. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an unnatural resonance. It wasn't Moyo. It wasn't anyone she knew. It came from ahead, where the trail vanished into a tangle of shadows. She tightened her grip on her rifle, her knuckles whitening. Focus. The ranger training kicked in. Fear could kill you out here faster than any predator. Steeling herself, she stepped forward, following the trail. The path became narrower, hemmed in by trees whose bark seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Thuli's boots crunched on something brittle. She glanced down and recoiled, a scattering of animal bones, arranged in a spiral pattern, each piece picked clean. Ahead, a clearing emerged, bathed in an otherworldly glow. Her breath quickened as she approached. In the center of the clearing lay a human boot, partially submerged in mud, its laces frayed and caked with grime. A few feet away was a ranger's hat, slashed open and soaked with dark stains. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through her chest. Thuli swung her rifle up, scanning the treeline. The shadows moved, not from the breeze, but as if something huge and unseen shifted just out of view. The glow intensified, and then she saw it. The trees at the edge of the clearing bore markings, carvings that glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. They weren't natural. Symbols she didn't recognize, ancient and menacing, etched deep into the bark as if by claws. The forest felt alive, sentient, and watching. Then came the sound of something heavy slithering through the undergrowth, circling her position. Thuli. The voice again, but closer now, guttural and distorted, as if multiple throats formed the sound at once. Thuli's body tensed, her rifle trembling in her grip. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted. The wilderness had become a predator, and she was its prey. The whisper came again, now impossibly close. Thuli. She swung her rifle in the direction of the voice, her eyes darting through the dense foliage. The trees loomed unnaturally, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Then, it stepped into the edge of her vision, a fleeting, monstrous silhouette. A tangle of shifting limbs, its form unnaturally elongated, as if it were trying to mimic something human but failing grotesquely. The glow from the carved symbols pulsed in rhythm with its movements, and the ground beneath her feet trembled faintly. Thuli stumbled back, her boot crunching over more bones. Her finger hovered over the trigger. She wanted to shoot, but what if it wasn't real? The creature didn't fully emerge, retreating into the shadows as if taunting her. A faint laugh echoed, not from one mouth, but many. She forced herself forward, each step heavier than the last. Fear clawed at her chest, but she refused to run. The trail led her to a small clearing, and she froze. In the center, tangled in roots that pulsed with unnatural life, was the missing ranger. Or what was left of him. His body had been grotesquely contorted, his limbs stretched and bent at impossible angles. His face was locked in a silent scream, and his skin bore the same glowing sigils as the trees. The roots twisted into his flesh, holding him as if he were part of the forest. The bile rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. The wilderness whispered again, this time in a language she didn't understand, the sound like a low chant. The sigils glowed brighter. Thuli stepped back, her mind racing. What is this? What am I supposed to do? The entity appeared again, just at the edge of the clearing. This time, its form became clearer, a grotesque amalgamation of human and nature. Its face was a hollow mask, its eyes glowing embers. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, as if they were pulled from the earth itself. Leave, it said, the word reverberating through the clearing. Its voice was many voices, layered and ancient. This is no place for you. Thuli stumbled back, her grip on the rifle slick with sweat. The creature didn't pursue her, it didn't need to. The forest seemed alive with its presence, every tree and root moving subtly in rhythm with its breath. She turned and fled, the sounds of the wilderness shifting and contorting around her. Trails she thought she knew twisted into unfamiliar paths. Her radio crackled with distorted static. At one point, she thought she heard Moyo's voice, but it broke apart into garbled screams. Hours later, or perhaps only minutes, it was impossible to tell, Thuli emerged from the forest, disheveled and trembling. The world outside felt too bright, too loud. Her colleagues approached, their faces a mix of concern and suspicion. "Did you find him?" Moyo asked, his voice cutting through the haze. Thuli nodded but avoided his gaze. Just his belongings. Signs of a struggle. Could have been a lion. The lie came easily, her voice steadier than she expected. She couldn't tell them the truth. She didn't know how to explain what she'd seen, and a deeper fear gnawed at her, the fear of what the wilderness might do if she uncovered its secrets. As they packed up, Thuli glanced back at the forest. The sigils had disappeared, the trees standing silent and still, but she knew it wasn't over. She felt it in her bones, in the unnatural heaviness of the air. As they drove away, a faint whisper echoed in her ears, almost too soft to hear, "Thuli." Her heart skipped a beat, but she kept her eyes forward. She didn't look back. Part 2. The sky was the color of ash, heavy and oppressive. Thuli sat on the edge of the veranda, her eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the clearing. The sounds of the bush were muted, as if the wilderness itself were holding its breath. Her arm itched again. She sighed, rolling up her sleeve. The dark, scaly patch on her forearm had spread further overnight, curling like roots up her skin. It glistened faintly in the dim light, the texture rough and almost reptilian. For a moment, she thought it moved, just a subtle ripple, but when she blinked, it was still. Her breath caught. She scratched at it furiously, her nails dragging until thin lines of blood welled up. But the scales remained, mocking her. The burning sensation beneath the surface intensified, making her pull her sleeve down in frustration. The forest rustled softly, though there was no breeze. A faint whisper floated on the air, so soft it could have been her imagination. "Thuli." The radio on her hip crackled, making her flinch. "Thuli, report to the main office." "We've got visitors," Moyo's voice said, flat and irritated. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to stand. As she headed for the station, the tree line seemed closer than before, the shadows beneath the trees darker. Inside the cramped office, the air was thick, like the storm outside had seeped into the walls. Moyo leaned against the desk, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. Across from him stood 3 figures, 2 researchers she didn't know and 1 man she knew too well. Benji. He turned as she entered, and his sharp eyes locked on hers. A slow grin spread across his face, more a sneer than a smile. Well, he said. Still playing Ranger, I see. Thought you'd quit after last year. Thuli's fists tightened, but she kept her face neutral. Benji. I hear you're the best they've got, he continued, mockery dripping from his words. Guess we're in good hands. Her jaw clenched. Better than yours. The smirk slipped from his face, replaced by something colder. Moyo cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Thuli, they're here to investigate the disappearances. You're taking them out tomorrow. No arguments. Her stomach churned, but she nodded stiffly. Understood. Benji gave her a mock salute. Looking forward to it. As Thuli turned to leave, one of the researchers rifled through a box of items on the desk. Is this from one of the missing rangers? He asked casually. Moyo nodded. Some of it was found at the last site. Didn't think to send it to HQ yet. The researcher pulled out a small notebook, its leather cover scratched and smeared with dirt. A faint, damp smell wafted from it, making him wrinkle his nose. Thuli's eyes landed on the next item, a tarnished metal badge, its surface stained with dark smears. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that badge. She'd left it behind, tangled in vines. Her gaze froze as the faintly engraved name flickered. For a moment, she saw Benji's name, crossed out with jagged, angry lines. She blinked, and the original name reappeared. Her breath hitched. Are you sure this isn't your badge, Benji? He leaned closer, inspecting it. I'd never be caught dead with something that tarnished. Looks like it belongs to someone who couldn't hack it out here. Maybe like you. His laughter grated on her nerves, but she didn't respond. The badge seemed to glint faintly, and the itch on her arm flared. Moyo waved her off. Get some rest, Thuli. You've got an early morning. The sun hung low as the group set out, casting long shadows over the dense undergrowth. Thuli led the way, her boots crunching against the earth, her senses sharp. The forest felt wrong, the usual sounds of birds and insects distant or entirely absent. Behind her, Benji muttered something under his breath, and the other rangers chuckled. Don't think this'll be a walk in the park just 'cause you're leading, he called out. Thuli ignored him, her focus on the path ahead. The scaly patch on her arm burned faintly, its presence a constant reminder. She glanced back briefly. Benji's smirk was still there, but it didn't reach his eyes. They pressed deeper, the canopy above thickening. The air grew heavier, the light dimmer. One of the rangers stumbled, clutching his forehead. You okay? Thuli asked. Just hot, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. His skin was pale, and his breathing shallow. Her stomach twisted, but she pressed on, the silence weighing on her. The fevered ranger collapsed an hour later, his body slick with sweat. Thuli knelt beside him, her hand on his burning forehead. We need to stop. Benji snorted. What, so we can babysit? Maybe you're not cut out for this after all. Shut up, Benji, she snapped, the heat of her anger matching the burn on her arm. The scaly patch had spread further, creeping toward her shoulder. She pulled her sleeve down quickly, but not before one of the researchers noticed. What is that? He asked, his voice trembling. Nothing, she lied, rising to her feet. The forest groaned, the sound low and guttural, like a living thing awakening. The fevered ranger gasped suddenly, his body jerking as if something moved beneath his skin. His eyes flew open, glowing faintly. You returned, he rasped, his voice layered with something ancient and wrong. The voice filled the clearing, low and resonant. One must stay. The forest requires balance. Benji stumbled back, his confidence shattered. This is your fault. He yelled. You brought us here. You knew. The scaly patch burned again, and Thuli felt her anger and fear coalesce. The entity's voice grew louder. Choose, Thuli, or all will stay. Her gaze shifted to Benji. His face was pale, his arrogance gone. You can't, he stammered. Thuli, please. Her fists clenched. I don't have a choice. She pointed at him. The forest moved. Branches shot forward, wrapping around Benji's legs and torso. He screamed, clawing at the ground as he was dragged toward the fevered ranger's convulsing body. The group watched in frozen horror. The fevered ranger's mouth stretched unnaturally wide as Benji was pulled closer, and with a wet, tearing sound, the forest claimed them both. Thuli turned to the remaining group, her sleeve hiding the scales now creeping toward her neck. We're leaving, she said hoarsely. They obeyed, but their fear of her was palpable. As they fled, she heard it again, soft and haunting, Thuli. She didn't look back. Part 3. The ranger station was unnervingly quiet. It wasn't the calm of peace, but a silence that crawled under the skin, magnified by the faint, unnatural rustle of the trees pressing too close. Thuli sat in the corner of the common room, her back against the cold wall. The flickering bulb overhead cast jagged shadows across the floor, matching the turmoil in her mind. Her arm throbbed again. She didn't need to look to know the scaly texture had spread beyond her arm, crawling across her collarbone and threatening her neck like greedy fingers. The rough, dark lines spiraled like veins under her skin, each flare of heat a visceral reminder of her transformation. She clenched her fist, digging her nails into her palm to resist the urge to scratch. Across the room, Sibo, a young researcher, eyed her with open suspicion. His darting gaze conveyed accusations he hadn't yet voiced. Beside him, Gardi, a ranger, sat by the window, pale and gaunt, his eyes fixed on the dark forest. I'm telling you, it's her, Sibo muttered. His voice, though low, carried heavy accusation. She brought this on us. Thuli didn't respond, her gaze locked on the floor. She was too exhausted to argue. Shut up, Gardi said flatly, not turning from the window. It does matter. Sibo snapped, louder now. Look at her arm. Look at what's happening to her. She's... I said shut up. Gardi's voice sharpened as he turned to glare at Sibo, his hollow eyes flashing with anger. You think it's her? Then why are you still here? Why didn't it take you? Sibo shrank back, his face flushing. I don't know. Exactly. Gardi's gaze returned to the window. None of us knows anything. A low groan echoed from outside, like wood bending under immense pressure. The survivors froze. Thuli's fingers twitched toward the rifle propped against the wall. The groan came again, louder. Gardi stood slowly, gripping the windowsill. The trees, he whispered. They're moving. Thuli forced herself to her feet, her body heavy and stiff. She crossed the room, peering over Gardi's shoulder. The edge of the forest, once 20 meters away, was closer now, the gnarled trunks leaning forward like silent witnesses. Do you see it now? Sibo's voice was barely a whisper. Do you see what she brought here? Ignoring him, Thuli gripped the edge of the table, her skin burning with heat that seemed alive. The air grew heavier, suffocating in its intensity. And then she heard it. Thuli. The voice slid into her mind, soft but sharp. She flinched, steadying herself against the table. Gardi looked at her sharply. What? Nothing, she lied, her throat dry. She grabbed the rifle and slung it over her shoulder. We need to stay inside. Lock the doors. Sibo shook his head, his panic rising. No. I'm not staying here. I'm leaving. You won't make it, Thuli said, her voice low but firm. The forest won't let you. You don't get to tell me what to do, he shot back, his fear spilling over. You're the reason we're in this mess. Thuli stepped toward him, gripping the rifle tightly. If you go out there, you won't come back. Do you understand me? The room fell silent, save for their ragged breathing. Then the whisper came again, louder, threading through the cracks in the walls. Thuli. Come back. Her head snapped toward the sound. It wasn't just in her mind now. The forest was calling. Her pulse quickened, and her scaly skin burned as if responding to the summons. I have to go, she said quietly. Gardi's eyes widened. You can't be serious. If I don't, it won't stop, she replied, her gaze steady. It'll come for all of us. The night outside was suffocating. The air clung to her skin, thick and oppressive. As she stepped into the forest, the scaly patches on her arm flared, their heat spreading to her chest. Each step felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her presence. The trees closed in around her, their branches brushing against her bare skin. She had shed her uniform, the heat and weight unbearable. Now clad in a thin tank top and shorts, her exposed skin bore the marks of her transformation. The scaly patches writhed faintly, alive with an energy she couldn't deny. Ahead, the forest opened into a clearing bathed in an unnatural green glow. The entity stood at its center, grotesque yet awe-inspiring. Its towering form of twisted roots, animal limbs, and human-like features pulsed with rhythmic energy. "Thuli," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "You have returned." Her knees threatened to buckle, but she stood firm. "I didn't choose this." "You were chosen long before you knew," the entity replied. "Your kind broke the balance. Now you will restore it." "What does that mean?" she demanded. The entity's branch-like limb extended, brushing her chest. The scaly patches flared with searing heat, and her vision swam. "You will become one with us, or they will pay the price." Thuli's mind raced, images of the survivors flashing before her eyes. "You want me to take your place," she realized. The entity didn't respond with words, but its presence filled her with chilling certainty. "You think you own me?" she growled, her body trembling but her resolve hardening. She tore a branch from the ground, its tip jagged. "You're wrong." With a scream, she plunged the branch into the entity's core. The forest roared, a deafening cry that shook the ground. The entity convulsed, its glowing eyes dimming before flickering out entirely. The oppressive heat on her skin began to fade as the scaly patches receded. Thuli collapsed to her knees, the silence of the forest heavy around her. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the ranger station, the cold floor pressing against her skin. The mangled bodies of Gardi and Sibo lay nearby, unrecognizable and brutalized. Her trembling hands reached for the radio. "There's been an incident," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos within. "A lion attack. 2 casualties." As she moved to clean the scene, the scaly patches on her skin glistened faintly under the flickering light. In the reflection of the window, she saw herself, changed, marked, and utterly alone.